Howdy folks, I'm Ben Starr, the Ultimate Food Geek. Welcome back to my messy kitchen. It has been 3 years since I introduced my super simple sourdough for lazy people method. And tens of thousands of people all over the world are now using this method to bake sourdough bread with practically no effort at all. Now, if you have stumbled upon this video because you are overwhelmed by how complex and crazy sourdough seems to be based on other YouTube channels, you are in the right place. If you have ended up here because you are sick of sourdough being on sourdough's schedule instead of yours, all of that tedious slapping and folding at specific intervals throughout the process, you've come to the right place. If you're here because you're absolutely sick and tired of feeding endlessly your starter and all of that discard and finding something to do with it, you're in the right place, because with my method, you will never discard sourdough starter, and you will only feed your sourdough starter when you need to make more, even if that's only a couple of times a year. And if you have already been using my simple sourdough method for the last several years, you're going to be pleasantly surprised because I have made the process even more simple, if you can believe that. So let's get right into it. For the first part of this video, I'm really not going to do a lot of explaining. I just want to do a quick demonstration of how little effort it takes to produce this loaf of bread. In the second part of the video, we'll get into all the nuts and bolts of everything. So what I'm going to do is turn on and zero my scale, and I'm going to add 4 ounces of sourdough starter at 100% hydration. We'll talk about that later. Now, my starter has not been fed in several months. All I did a second ago was just stir it back together to make sure none of that liquid on top came off by itself. To that, we're going to add 12 ounces of water. I like to use filtered water, but tap water does work as well. Okay, we're going to stir those together. Now, for metric equivalents, just check the video description underneath this video. I have all that laid out for you. This is just regular all-purpose flour. You can use bread flour too. That's totally fine. We're adding 1 pound and 4 ounces. And we're going to add 3/4 ounce of kosher salt. Other types of salt will work, and we will talk later in the video about how this salt content for this method is a little bit higher than most sourdough recipes, but the salt content is the secret to why this recipe works. So, about 3/4 ounce. That's all of our ingredients. Now we're going to give it a good stir. As the dough starts to come together, it becomes a little bit harder to work with a spoon. So at this point, even though this is technically a no-knead method, I like to get in there with my hands just for 15 or 20 seconds to bring everything together and to get the sides of the bowl clean. Now, I'm just going to cover this and let it sit on the countertop at room temperature until tomorrow. It has been about 20 hours for this first fermentation, and this dough has just been sitting on my countertop covered at room temperature, and I've done absolutely nothing to it but completely ignore it. So now it's time to shake. Now, this first rising window actually has a lot of flexible rise time. We will talk more about that in the second part of the video. My baking vessel today is this cast iron Dutch oven. It's about 4.5, 5 quarts. It's got raw cast iron on the inside, which I prefer, but you can use any kind of Dutch oven. We'll talk a lot more about baking vessels in the second part of the video, and I'll teach you how to bake it in a loaf pan as well. But I just gave it a little bit of a spritz with oil, and now it's time to shape our loaf. Now for this, we just want to use a little bit of flour because we want the work surface to be a little bit sticky, and we do want to add some flour to our hands. Now I'm going to take this dough gently out of the bowl onto the surface. Some more flour on my hands, and now I'm just going to move this around until I get a nice tight boule. All right, now I'm going to transfer this to my Dutch oven, cover it, and let it ferment for 90 minutes at room temperature. And after 90 more minutes of ignoring it, it's time to bake. Now, before we do that, we need to score the loaf, and there's several different ways to do that we'll address in the second part of the video, but the easiest and quickest way is just to use scissors. We're going to do 1 right down the center of the loaf, and then 2 scores on each side. Now, this goes into a cold oven at 425 degrees for 45 minutes. Just turned on the oven, and now the pot goes inside. So as the oven preheats, we're gonna get a little bit extra boost to that bread, and at 45 minutes, we're gonna take the lid off and continue baking for another 15. After 45 minutes, we just pull the lid right off the pot, and we put it back in for 15 more minutes. And after 15 minutes, it's done. Now we're just gonna dump this gorgeous loaf out onto a cooling rack to cool. Now, seriously, folks, I'll be dead shocked if I spent more than 10 minutes worth of effort over the last day producing this loaf of sourdough bread. It practically made itself. I'm gonna give it just a couple of minutes to cool. We'll slice into it so that you can see the crumb, and then we'll get right down into the nitty-gritty of how you can produce this loaf at home with an equivalent amount of laziness. Now, this is a really spectacular loaf, especially when you compare it to the amount of time we spent on it, which is practically nothing. So I'm gonna go ahead, normally I like to let my loaves cool a little bit more before we slice into them, but I'm gonna go ahead, cut into this so that you can see. Really, really beautiful loaf of bread. Now, it is absolutely true that this effortless loaf does not have those giant air bubbles that look so pretty on magazine covers, right? But with my thinking, you can't smear olive oil or butter or jam on a hole, right? What does a hole taste like? Well, it tastes like nothing. So for me, I'd rather have a nice, perfect, even crumb that I can toast beautifully, that I can smear all sorts of deliciousness on top of. And when it takes me less than 10 minutes to produce that loaf, I'm all for it. All right, let's get into how you can do this at home. Your first ingredient is sourdough starter. If you don't have one of those, start asking around on Facebook, or you might be able to convince one of your local artisan bakeries to sell you some, or you can just make it yourself. All you need is flour and water, the same ingredients that you need for bread. I have lots of sourdough starter videos right here on my YouTube channel, so spend some time with those. It will teach you how you can create your own very unique sourdough starter from scratch that will be unlike any other human being's sourdough starter anywhere on the planet. That's one of the super cool features about creating your own sourdough starter from scratch, is that it's unique to your kitchen. And I've mentioned before that with my simple sourdough method, you never have to feed and discard starter. You only feed your starter when you're getting low on starter and you need to make more. This repetitive process of feeding and discarding your sourdough is super wasteful and utterly unnecessary, because your sourdough starter only needs to eat every several months in order to be super happy and healthy and make a delicious loaf of bread. Elsewhere on my YouTube channel, I have baked perfect loaves of sourdough bread with starter that had been starved for almost an entire year. So let's dispense with this stupid notion of you have to feed your starter before you bake bread with it. That's completely untrue. My starter here has not been fed in months and months. I don't know when the last date I fed it was. Now, when you open up your starter and it hasn't been fed in a long time, you may have a layer of dark liquid kind of floating around on top. Some people call that hooch. That's just water, ethyl alcohol, and all sorts of flavorful byproducts of the yeast and bacteria's metabolism process. Do not, under any circumstances, pour that water off. The first thing that does is screw up the hydration of your starter. We always need to know exactly how much flour and how much water is in any given measure of starter, otherwise we might screw up the hydration rate of our recipe. So just stir that liquid back in if any of it has gathered on top. Do not pour it out. Now you might notice that my starter seems pretty liquidy, and this is just because it's been a long time since I've fed it. The starter has become very acidic. It has broken down all of the gluten bonds that make sourdough starter thick. But if you have recently created your starter, or if it's been fed in the last week or two, it's going to be a lot thicker. That's perfectly fine. We still are working with a starter that is 50% water and 50% flour. So regardless of its texture, I know that when I add 4 ounces of the starter into the bowl, I've added 2 ounces of flour and 2 ounces of water to my recipe. Now, if you discover after trying this method for the first time that your dough is excessively watery and sticky and you can't work with it, or it's super, super dry, this means that your sourdough starter is at a different ratio of hydration. Mine is at 100%, and that means every time I feed it equal weights, not measures, but weights of water and flour. So I always know my starter is made up of half flour and half water. You may need to make some feeding corrections to your starter in order to get it back to that 100% hydration balance, And my troubleshooting simple sourdough videos will help you do that. Now, we need to talk for just a second about the elephant in the room, the scale. I get a lot of people comment on my channel saying, you don't need a scale to bake sourdough. My grandma baked sourdough her whole life and she didn't have a scale. Guess what? You are not your grandma. Yes, your grandma may have been able to bake a great loaf of sourdough bread just by sight and touch with no measuring at all. But she did that every day for 50 years and she got accustomed to exactly how the dough felt. You will become good at doing that after you have done this for several years. But if you are new to baking, the only way I can assure that you will get consistent results from this recipe every single time you bake it is if you are measuring with a scale. So if you want to get this one, which is my favorite one, I've used it at my restaurant for years, you can grab the link in the video description below the video. But get a scale. You can get a cheap one that's not expensive that will last you for years of service, and it will ensure you consistent results loaf to loaf to loaf. So I'm going to turn on and zero my scale and add 4 ounces of sourdough starter well stirred. And guys, if you go over 1/10 of an ounce on any of this, that's not going to make a huge difference. But if you've gone over by more than 3 or 4/10 of an ounce, that's 0.3 or 0.4, and you want to back up, that's totally fine. For you metric folks, this is 113 grams of starter, and all of the metric equivalents, as I've said, are in the video description, which is completely written out right below this video. Expand that, the recipe's right there for you. Next, we're going to zero our scale and measure out 12 ounces of water. Now that's ounces, not fluid ounces. But guess what? 12 fluid ounces of water weighs 12 ounces. They are one and the same. I get a lot of people asking me that question too. Fluid ounces are based on the weight of an ounce of water. I am using filtered water, and this is because municipal water supplies add chloramines, chlorine, or bromine to their water supply to sterilize or get rid of potential contaminants. What are the yeast and bacteria that are alive and healthy in our sourdough starter? They are contaminants. They're just the contaminants that we want, and they are functional for us. So if we're adding compounds to our bread dough that are designed to curtail the activity of bacteria, we're sort of working against ourselves, aren't we? Now, I know for a fact, because I have resorted to using tap water when I didn't have filtered water around, and because many people have commented that their tap water works fine, yes, if you do not have access to filtered water, use your tap water, it will work for you. But if you tasted my tap water, you wouldn't want me adding that into the bread. All right, we are going to give this a stir to kind of distribute the starter into the water. And next, we're going to add 1 pound and 4 ounces of flour. Now, I mentioned before, this is organic, unbleached, all-purpose flour. I get it from Costco in bulk. That's really because I don't want to devote pantry space to 2 different flours and have bread flour and all-purpose flour in my pantry at the same time. This recipe works just fine with all-purpose flour. If you use a higher protein bread flour, you might get a little bit more loft out of your bread and a slightly nicer texture to it, but I'm not sure it's something that you would necessarily notice unless you were tasting both loaves side by side. So regular all-purpose flour works completely fine. You only need to maintain 1 type of flour stream in your pantry if you want to bake sourdough bread. 1 pound, 4 ounces, and then our final ingredient, which is salt. We are going to add about 3/4 of an ounce or 0.7 ounces of kosher salt. Now at this point we got to stop because of all of the outcry that I get regarding my recipes, the amount of salt in this recipe is the one that people seem to have an absolute conniption over. Yes, this recipe has a higher salt content than traditional sourdough recipes. That is by design. The higher salt content is what gives you a longer window of time between having to form that loaf of bread after the first fermentation. Most bread recipes need to be baked pretty much immediately after they double in bulk. But the addition of the salt helps calm that yeast activity down, stretch it out over a longer period of time, and so you've got much more flexibility. We could shape this loaf about 12 hours from now, or we could shape it about 30 hours from now, depending on our schedule. I occasionally get a comment that says, this bread was so salty, I could not eat it. And there's one of 2 things going on there. Either that person eats a sodium-restricted diet and just does not ever have salt on their palate, so they are super tasting that salt, or they mismeasured. They probably measured with a measuring spoon instead of with a scale. I really think that that one's the culprit. But If you find after using Morton's kosher salt and measuring correctly by weight that this bread is too salty for you, back it off to ½ ounce of salt. Just know that you're going to need to be a little bit more focused on shaping that loaf as soon as it doubles in volume. Okay, now we're going to give this all a good stir. Now this is going to start getting too stiff to stir, and at that point, ditch the spoon, get in there with your hand for just a few seconds to bring everything together. We're not kneading this bread. Normally during a kneading recipe, you take that bread for 10 or 15 minutes and do this, but really, this is only to make sure we're just incorporating all of that extra floury crumble, getting it put into the matrix of our dough, to make sure everything is mixed properly. Your dough should be somewhat sticky, but not so sticky that with a clean hand, it comes off in big chunks and you can't get your fingers detached from it. Now off camera, I'm going to mix up one more batch of dough so that I can show you two different ways of rising and two different methods for baking, one in a Dutch oven and one in a regular loaf pan. Now as I'm mixing up this second loaf, I want to break for just a second to explain that this bread is really super versatile as a base for flavored sourdough loaves. So when you're stirring these ingredients together in the very beginning, this is the point when you will add any additions. My personal favorite is fresh or dried rosemary. Absolutely beautiful, wonderful, fragrant loaf. But the sky's the limit. You could put chocolate chips in here. You could put shredded sharp cheddar cheese and some jalapenos or green chilies. Olives or roasted garlic are another one of my favorites. But they're going to go into the matrix here in the beginning when you're stirring all of your ingredients together and stay in there throughout the fermentation process, which allows their flavors to really permeate the dough. Now, the one thing to keep in mind when you're doing this, however, is that if you are adding an ingredient that's particularly salty, like olives or pickled jalapenos, you want to back off just a little bit on the salt addition just to make sure your loaf isn't too salty. Similarly, if you were using a very wet ingredient like roasted red peppers or caramelized onions or a can of diced green chilies, they are going to add their own moisture content to the dough that's going to be sucked out and kind of distributed throughout the matrix as it reaches equilibrium while it ferments. So if you are adding a super wet ingredient, back off ½ ounce or even up to an ounce on the water addition of the recipe, just to make sure you don't end up with a loaf that's too sticky for you to handle. Now to prepare the dough to rise, I like to spray or oil my bowl a little bit. It's not necessary, but it does help it drop out of the bowl more easily after the first fermentation is completed. For those that are familiar with my first video, I do a lot of rising in Ziploc bags. Now, I feel like that's a valuable technique for beginners to this method because it really gives you an easy visual of when your dough has reached its proper fermentation. You can easily see that it's doubled in bulk and the bag will be inflated with the carbon dioxide that's being produced by the yeast. So you really know it's done its complete first fermentation and it's ready to shape. But I think some folks thought that this was an integral part of the actual method, and that's completely not. It was really only for visual demonstration purposes, but we are going to do it today so that folks who are new to the channel can see that beautiful loveliness of that bread dough all puffed up inside the Ziploc bag like a balloon once it's ready to shape. Now, if you're rising in a bowl, you definitely want to cover it with something, a sheet pan, a plate, some plastic wrap, something like that. Now these just sit on the countertop at room temperature until they have doubled in bulk. And there's no recipe in the world that can tell you exactly how long that is going to take. It is a factor of your individual starter and the environment in which the dough is fermenting. If your starter happens to be a very vigorous starter, you may be ready to bake in 8 to 12 hours. Likewise, if the ambient temperature in your kitchen is 82 or 85 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to be a very short rise time before it's time for your bread to be shaped and baked. But if your starter isn't super vigorous, or if it's been 6 months since you've given it a feeding, it may take this dough 24 hours, 30 hours, or even longer before it's ready to be shaped. Likewise, if it's the dead of winter and it's 60 degrees Fahrenheit in your kitchen, it might take it 30 to 36 hours until it's doubled. You are going to learn the characteristics of your individual starter and the environment in your kitchen and really know about how long it's going to take you to get this bread until it has doubled in size. The important thing is at least doubled in size. You have a window of 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, even longer after the dough has doubled before you absolutely must shape it and then get it in the oven 90 minutes later. That's thanks to that higher salt content. But you must make sure that it has at least doubled in volume, and at any point after that, then it can be shaped into a loaf and prepared for baking. So it's 5 p.m. here now. We're going to take a look at these in the morning after I wake up and see what kind of activity we've gotten. Before we shape these loaves, I want to talk just briefly about timing for your first fermentation or the bulk fermentation. So many online sourdough methods have you discard and feed your starter once, sometimes 2 or 3 times before you get ready to bake. And the reason for that is to shorten the baking period so that it is closer to baking with conventional store-bought yeast. However, we know for a fact that the longer bread takes to rise, the more flavor is produced in the resulting loaf. Some of these methods then have you put the rising loaf in the refrigerator to slow down or retard that process so that you get more flavor development. Then why do they have you feed your starter right before baking to speed up the process if they're then going to slow it down? It makes absolutely no sense. The longer your bread takes during this initial bulk fermentation process, the more flavor it's going to have. This is why I advocate not ever feeding your sourdough starter, because a starving starter produces a more delicious loaf, even though it takes a little bit longer for that first bulk fermentation. Now, as I've mentioned, only you are going to be able to understand how long this first fermentation period should be. But for the overwhelming majority of you, you can shape within 12 to 30 hours of your initial mixing process in preparation for that final 90-minute rise before baking. But for some of you, your starters are going to be super hyperactive, and you may only need 6 to 8 hours of this first rise. The rule of thumb is to wait until you have achieved at least doubling of the bulk of your dough. And once you have achieved that, you've still got a window of 8 to 12 more hours that you can wait without overproofing the dough, thanks to that higher salt content we added to the dough. So we are now at a total of 21 hours from mixing, and you can see this beautiful bag is just blown straight up with carbon dioxide. It's nice and taut. This dough is ready to be shaped. But of course, before we shape, we have to discuss how we're going to bake this loaf. First of all, we're going to talk about the Dutch oven method. And as you saw in the first part of the video, my favorite Dutch oven is this like 4.5 to 5 quart Dutch oven that's got raw cast iron on the inside. The reason I prefer raw cast iron on the inside is because the more you heat a Dutch oven, the more this enamel starts to weaken. And in my original method, where you preheated the Dutch oven at 500 degrees Fahrenheit before putting the loaf into it, that can definitely weaken the structure of your enamel. I have gone through quite a number of these in the last 20 years. So, if you've got a few bucks to shell out to a nice dedicated bread baking Dutch oven, I typically have a link to the current cheapest and best model of these on Amazon. Just expand the video description below. But if you cannot find that one, because they often sell out, you're basically looking for a Dutch oven that has an interior diameter of about 9 to 9.5 inches and a depth of about 4 inches. And that's typically a 4.5 to 5 quart Dutch oven. Size, though, is more important than volume. You don't want a bigger one that's shallow because your bread's going to lift the lid off the top as it bakes. So the smaller ones that you get, this is like a 3 quart Dutch oven. You can do this as long as your depth is at least 4 inches deep, but you also do run the risk of the bread being a little bit misshapen. It's going to have tall, narrow sides, and the top might get pressed down with the lid. But in a pinch, one of these smaller Dutch ovens will do. Now, because I baked that first demonstration loaf in my favorite pan that's got raw cast iron on the inside, I am going to be baking this loaf in a similarly sized, fully enameled Dutch oven. And of course, over time, as we use a spray to spray the inside of this Dutch oven and then put the loaf into it, it's going to eventually discolor with the same type of seasoning that you get in a raw cast iron skillet as you bake with it over the years. Only it will look, slightly discolored. You'll get some marks on the inside. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just ugly. If that discoloration over time really bothers you, you can get rid of it with a little elbow grease and some bleach. So let's give a little bit of a spray to the inside of our Dutch oven. And now it's time to shape. We want to use minimal flour on our surface, and that's because we want the dough to stick to the surface somewhat. It provides us the tension we need to form a nice tight loaf. But you definitely want plenty of flour on your hands to prevent your hands from sticking to the dough, which is what we definitely don't want. Just going to remove this dough gently from the bowl and let it glide out onto the surface. And you will get the hang of this pretty quickly after you start doing it, but basically you're going to drag the underside of your hand like this along the surface of the table or the work surface to kind of tuck the bottom part of the dough underneath. So you're basically just kind of pulling the dough towards you, rotating and pulling, rotating and pulling, rotating and pulling, and you see that's forming a really nice tight skin on the very top of the surface. All right. You want to kind of tuck in under there just to make sure all of that gets sealed. The tighter that dough is, the higher it's going to rise in the oven. Now we just gently set that into the rising vessel. It gets covered and sits on the countertop at room temperature for 90 minutes. Now, as promised, I'm also going to show you how to bake this in a loaf pan. And to do this method properly, you're going to need 2 identically sized loaf pans. Spray one really good on the inside, even if it's nonstick. Leave the other one unsprayed. Now we're going to lightly flour our surface and dump that dough out onto the work surface. You may have to gently pull away the sides of the Ziploc if you're using the Ziploc method, just to make sure it all comes out. All right, so I'm going to try to unfold this and basically gently stretch it out into a square. Don't get in there all mashing it up because you're going to blow out all of those delicious carbon dioxide bubbles that have formed that are giving our loaf its interior texture. Now you want a fairly even thickness across the loaf, and you want it to be slightly longer than your loaf pan. Flour our fingers again, and now we're going to roll this up like we're making cinnamon rolls, giving it just a gentle kind of tuck each time we bring it over. We end up with a log like this. Now, we are going to pinch down the ends of the log at the exact length of the inside of the loaf pan. Kind of like lay your hands down to mash that out just a bit. Now we're going to tuck those mashed down parts underneath. Starting to get sticky on my hands, so I'm going to add a little bit more flour. You can also wet your hands, that'll prevent it from sticking. And then we're going to lift this and transfer it right here into the loaf pan. Now we're going to close this loaf pan with the other loaf pan, and it too is going to rise on your countertop at room temperature for 90 minutes before baking. So what's the difference between the two methods? Well, the Dutch oven method produces a far superior loaf, and that is for 2 reasons. The first is that the thermal mass of the cast iron really holds that heat in and radiates it evenly through the inside. So your crust is nice and thick and shattery and evenly browned and delicious. Also, the lid is holding moisture in to the cooking environment. So as the temperature inside rises, not only are those little bubbles of carbon dioxide expanding, which is what causes that loaf to lift up nice and high, but as the water content within the bread begins to evaporate, it creates a very humid environment right here inside this Dutch oven. And what that humidity does is it prevents the loaf from crusting over super early in the baking process. So we get maximum rise out of our loaf before it crusts over, which locks in the final size of the loaf. Also, that extra humidity kind of bounces in and out of that crust as it's baking. It makes the crust quite a bit thicker, really shattery, and utterly delicious. With the loaf pan method, we are trapping some moisture in here, so we do get some benefit of that extra humid environment. But because these really aren't a proper fitting pair, we are going to lose more moisture to the inside of the oven than we do with the method that has a dedicated heavy lid that's really keeping things closed and sealed. Also, loaf pans are typically quite a bit thinner with less thermal mass than a cast iron Dutch oven. That means that the crust is going to brown unevenly. You may have some areas that are darker and some areas that are lighter because the heat just goes from the oven straight through into the loaf. We don't have the moderating effect of that heavy cast iron. But it will still work if you're really trying to make homemade sourdough for sandwiches, or if you simply don't have a Dutch oven like this. Now, if you still really want that old world style boule-shaped loaf, but you don't have a cast iron Dutch oven, you can literally use any oven-safe pot that's safe up to that 425-degree baking temperature, meaning no plastic lids, and it doesn't have to be quite as heavy as the cast iron Dutch. You just won't get that really nice thermal mass moderation that makes the loaf brown so perfectly evenly. So a regular steel or aluminum Dutch oven will work, but if you start to notice signs of extra over-browning of your crust or burning of your crust, you might need to lower your oven temperature to 400 or 415, or just slightly adjust your baking times until you get a loaf where the crust isn't too dark for your liking. Before these go into the cold oven, we need to do our scoring. And scoring is really, its function is predominantly visual, but it has a little bit of a functional effect as well. As this bread rises up in the oven, if we don't guide it on where to open up, it's just going to rip open. And that can actually look quite nice and rustic. However, if we guide the bread as to where it opens up evenly, and we get a fairly even structure on the inside of the bread from end to end. So it's a really good idea to make sure you go ahead and score it. Now, I showed you in the first loaf scoring with some big kitchen shears. I'm going to show you with a razor blade now how to get the so-called fabled sourdough ear. That's the little like flap that opens up as the bread bakes. And for that, you're going to need either a plain old cheap razor blade or something that's called a lame, or if you're mispronouncing it, a lame. To do this, you're going to go straight across the center with your razor blade at sort of like a 30 to 45 degree angle, and you're just going to cut all the way across the loaf, about ½ inch in. And you want to do that fairly evenly across the top of that loaf. And that just tells the loaf you're going to open up this way as it bakes. Super simple. Of course, you can also use your kitchen shears and just snip some lines on the top of it. But the kitchen shears or scissors don't do quite as good a job if you're doing this particular cut to try to achieve the sourdough ear. Now, for our regular loaf, just use scissors. Now, I use the bigger scissors in the first section, so I'm going to use some smaller scissors just to show you how we do that. You're going to go down about ½ inch to 3/4 inch all the way across. Recover. Now, these go into a cold oven that has not been preheated. Now, we're going to turn our oven on to 425 degrees, 45 minutes covered. The most frequent questions or complaints I got on my original video, other than the salt content or the scale being a requirement, were folks that were saying that their loaf did not rise. It turned out fairly flat and dense. And that is either a result of overproofing, meaning you rose the dough for too long, or underproofing, which means you didn't rise the dough quite long enough. This adjusted shorter second rise time that's finished rising in the oven inside the baking vessel really takes care of a lot of issues related to both underproofing and overproofing. But again, you're going to have to sort of get to know your starter. If your starter is really sluggish and it takes you a full 20 or 24 hours to get to that first doubling, you may need to extend your second rise time by 15 or 30 minutes. If your starter is going gangbusters and your loaf is like doubled in 8 hours, you may need to think about reducing that second rise time to about 60 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and take the lid off of my loaf pan. Look at that. Beautiful. All right, now both loaves have been in for a full hour, so we're going to check them. And that looks perfect. But at 45 minutes covered and 15 minutes uncovered, if your loaf is still very pale, you're going to need to leave it in there a little bit longer, and next time you might adjust your oven's baking temperature up to 450 degrees. Conversely, if you're getting burning, especially on the bottom of your loaves or anything like that, you might need to lower your oven's baking temperature the next time. Also, if you prefer a very heavy, crackly crust, it's perfectly fine to leave these loaves in the oven a little bit longer than that final 15 minutes, say 20 or 25, if you want to get a really nice, hard, crisp crust. That's entirely up to you. Our loaves are done and they are beautiful. I'm going to let them cool for a bit before we cut into them to see what they look like, but just look at this. Compared to the amount of effort that we expended out here, it's just unbelievable. We've got a gorgeous ear here on this beautiful boule. We've got a perfect high loaf of sandwich bread. Some of you are going to ask, what about the refrigerator? Because in my original video, I gave you a couple of options for chunking that dough in the fridge to slow it down in case you suddenly ran out of time and couldn't bake it on bake day. With the simplification of the second half of this method where you don't have to preheat an empty Dutch oven and then transfer your loaf into it, it really is best that the loaf go directly from shaping to the countertop for 90 minutes and into the oven. So if you do want to refrigerate your dough, either out of convenience because you want to do as many steps ahead of bake day as possible, or because you want to eke out every tiny little bit of flavor out of that fermentation process that you can, the time for the dough to go into the refrigerator is immediately after mixing it up. I have successfully refrigerated dough for 4 days in the refrigerator and then taken it out, give it a couple of hours to warm up to room temperature, and then give it a shape. You may find, though, that 90-minute second fermentation needs to be extended just a little bit, maybe by 15 to 30 additional minutes, just to make sure that that loaf has fully doubled before it goes into the oven. I find this is a really practical way for me to mix up sourdough at home where I have a kitchen and to scale and all that kind of stuff. Then I chunk it in a Ziploc bag, put it in the fridge, then it goes in my cooler and I take it camping with me to bake it over a fire. Or I take it with me when I go to visit friends or relatives so that I can bake it at their home and have fresh bread right out of the oven. If you are a high elevation baker, I have baked this particular loaf with no modifications at all above 8,000 feet in Cloudcroft, New Mexico. The reason this doesn't really require modification at elevation is because at higher elevation, water evaporates at a lower temperature. But because our actual baking environment isn't a big dry oven, it's the inside of that Dutch oven which is holding in the moisture as it evaporates, there's not much modification that needs to take place. But if you discover that the bread feels overcooked after baking it at elevation, just lower your oven temperature by about 5 degrees Fahrenheit and you'll be fine. Okay, we're going to cut into these now and take a look at the interior. At home, I do not recommend you make it a regular practice to slice warm bread. The bread can gum up on your knife and it can start tearing it. So ideally, you want your bread to fully cool to room temperature. Then it's a little bit more sturdy. You can get good slices out of it. Put your slices in a nice basket. Rewarm it in the microwave for 30 to 40 seconds before you serve it. And if you're one of those horrible people that hates the microwave and thinks it's terrible, I've got a video coming soon for you. Microwaves are amazing when used properly. All right, let's take a peek. I hope you can hear that crust. It's just shattering and so absolutely beautiful. All right, this is literally perfect for sandwiches and toast. Can't get much better than that. I'm also going to cut off a little piece and taste it. Oh, so nice. That crust is shattery, not too thick. You know, sometimes that crust gets so thick you slice the top of your mouth. This is not that type of bread. That's wonderful. All right, and now for our beautiful boule. And there we have it. Absolutely beautiful bread, incredible flavor. And we spent less than 10 minutes on this, you guys. Now, no offense to those folks that really work hard on their YouTube channels to teach you guys how to do high hydration bread. I've baked hundreds of loaves of high hydration bread for my restaurant. But you know which loaf of bread my restaurant diners regularly say they love the most? This one right here. So sometimes it's fun for a special occasion to get involved in a really complex technique that involves you babysitting that bread, flipping it, folding it, slapping it every 20 minutes, making sure it's fermenting at just the right temperature and humidity level, having to have a pizza stone in your oven to bake it. That can be a really fun experiment. But for those of us that have better things to do with our time, 10 minutes of effort or less, and you can churn out this baby, I don't know what to tell you other than you're welcome. If you are a fellow food geek and you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. Give me a thumbs up on that like button. I took a couple-year break from making videos because I was super busy at my restaurant, but I am ready to churn out all sorts of amazing and wonderful things for you guys, not only related to sourdough, but anything you can possibly imagine related to the kitchen. Thanks for watching and have a great day.